So, welcome to week 5, where we're going to be discussing rulemaking and regulations. For today, we're going to first define rules and regulations, then shift over to why Congress delegates, like rulemaking. Then we'll get into the process of rulemaking, and finally, we'll be discussing implementation of those rules and regulations. So, what are rules and regulations? Just to be clear, the terms rules and regulations are largely used interchangeably. So, when I say rules, that means regulations as well, and you can also feel free to use them interchangeably. So, Ken Meyer defines regulations as attempts by government to control the behavior of citizens, corporations, and subgovernments. And by subgovernments, there, that means things like state and local governments. By contrast, like the first one is sort of like Ken Meyer's definition is a little more straightforward of a definition. By contrast, though, Eisner, Worsham, and Rehnquist define it as an array of public policies explicitly designed to govern economic activity and its consequences at the level of the industry, the firm, or individual unit of activity. In any case, these are largely the same, right? You're trying, as the government, to shape the behavior of businesses, other governments, and the people, okay? Now, you might be wondering, doesn't Congress make rules, regulations, and laws? The short answer is yes. Yes, Congress does do all of that, but they ultimately delegate a lot of this authority over to agencies, and this is for a few reasons. First, members of Congress don't want to be too specific in defining a policy because it might hurt their re-election chances. They don't want to make anyone angry by targeting a specific industry. Second, and this is closely related to the first, members of Congress want to shift that blame. If something goes wrong, they can throw the bureaucracy or agency under the bus. Is a specific industry mad now? Well, you can blame that agency and not elected officials, okay? And finally, and perhaps most importantly, the agency likely has more expertise than the legislator on the subject. Really, a legislator can't know every policy domain really, really well. They have to rely on the bureaucracy's expertise to put this rule, to put this regulation into practice, okay? So they are relying ultimately on that agency's expertise. Now, how does rulemaking occur? What does the process look like? And so this is going to be talking about the informal rulemaking process. And we'll have a brief discussion at the end about other possible processes like formal, hybrid, and exempt. Now, your book lays out a few stages in about notice and comment rulemaking. So typically there is the first pre-rule stage where agencies informally gather information from stakeholders about potential problems or costs in implementing a specific rule. The second stage is notice of proposed rulemaking. This is essentially the public release of the rule and the public comment stage. So they classify this here as one stage, but in my lecture here, I've instead classified it as 2 because that tends to be how scholars think of this stage. And then finally, there's a final rule where either a new rule has been implemented or changes were made to an existing rule. Now, let's delve a bit more into these stages, starting with the pre-rule, okay? In this stage, they'll be working on 3 tasks, okay? First, the bureaucracy is going to explore what concerns or research needs to be done before implementing the rule. Second, this stage is considered somewhat informal, but they're going to be communicating with businesses and agency groups industrial groups about the proposed rule. They're going to talk about any problems or costs that they see that might occur in implementing this new rule. And finally, be aware that businesses and interest groups will want to influence the formation of this rule so that it really works in their favor or perhaps has lower costs on them. These groups are going to want to be involved as early as possible in the process because the earlier you're involved in the process, the more influence you're likely going to have. The second stage is notice of proposed rule. This is just where the proposed rule is published in the Federal Register. The Federal Register is almost like the federal government's newspaper. It used to be a paper copy, but under the Obama administration, they moved for the Federal Register to be more transparent and accountable. So there is now a website you can visit and see what proposed rules there are and provide comment there. In any case, when it gets published, it will detail the proposed rule. It will describe what legislation enables that rule to be made. And finally, it will also provide information about the comment period. How long do businesses and individuals have to provide comments? Months, years? It will be explicit in this stage. Now, the third stage is the comment period itself, which is just when the public can submit comments. Don't think that this is just the general public commenting, though. Businesses also participate in this stage. If businesses raise some serious, legitimate issues during this comment period, the agencies will probably need to respond to those. Okay? And finally, we have the final rule, which is going to be published in the Federal Register and will become law by being codified in the Code of Federal Regulations, or CFR for short. Depending on comments, the proposed rule might be modified from its original wording, or it might stay the same. Now, what we just described is informal rulemaking. There are other kinds of rulemaking, though. There's formal rulemaking. In order to have formal rulemaking, though, there needs to be what is essentially like magical and very specific legislation that allows agencies to hold formal rulemaking. Agencies have to be given that power through statutory law. They cannot just make up that power on their own. In formal rulemaking, there is usually a formal hearing where agencies allow interested groups and individuals to provide testimony. You can see an example on the right here. Agencies don't always want to do this, though, because it's a lot more work on the part of the agency to hold a formal hearing. This is quite time intensive to set up a formal hearing. There's also hybrid rulemaking, which is really like a combination of informal and formal rulemaking. For these, for hybrid rulemaking, legislation typically requires formal information gathering, but not quite to the level of a hearing. These are usually a little bit rarer and can take on a few different configurations, but I just want to make you aware of them. Some rulemaking is actually exempt from public comment, though. In other words, the public and organizations don't really get a chance to weigh in on the rule change. These tend to be focused on internal workings of agencies, like internal management, managerial operations, and procurement contracts. Another category of exempt rulemaking is military operations and foreign affairs. In some cases, we just wouldn't want information about military operations and foreign affairs to be public, right? For people to comment on because it might risk national security. Of course, rulemaking also gets delegated to state entities as well. Oftentimes, statutory law delegates rulemaking to states, and each state has slightly different processes. But in many ways, it mirrors what occurs at the federal level. So let's take a brief look at Idaho's rulemaking process. So there is the proposed stage. Proposed rulemaking involves proposing a new rule or changing an existing one. The agency publishes the new or changed rule to the Idaho Administrative Bulletin, and the public can provide comments. Then it shifts over into being pending, where it's been adopted and approved by the agency, but it needs to get approval from the legislature before it becomes final and effective. After it has the approval of the legislature, it will become effective upon the conclusion of that legislative session, and it will be codified in the Idaho Administrative Code. In Idaho, there are a few other types of rulemaking processes as well, like negotiated rulemaking. This is really more of an optional process in which all of the interested parties and the agency seek a consensus on the content of a rule. Agents are really encouraged to proceed through the informal stage of negotiation whenever is possible. There's also temporary rulemaking. So if the governor finds that a temporary adoption of a rule protects the public health, safety, or welfare, complies with deadlines in amendments to governing law or federal programs, or confers a benefit, the agency may proceed with temporary rulemaking. And that rule expires at the conclusion of the next regular legislative session. Now, what happens after a rule is published? If businesses or individuals do not support the new rule, they can take it to court and dispute it. This is another way in which organizations can influence the rules, although typically they prefer to influence earlier in the process. Once a rule has been put into law, once it has been codified, it becomes very tricky to undo that. So they want to intervene earlier in the process. But once the rules get implemented, are businesses or individuals going to be in compliance with it? Are they abiding by it? Because now these agencies need to enforce the rules, and that can be quite tricky. Now, rules can be enforced and implemented in different ways, as your textbook sort of lays out. Some, for instance, are very strict, and they allow no deviations whatsoever. This is considered precision-based, where it's very rules-oriented and is characterized as sort of tough enforcement of the law. On the other hand, there's more intention-based enforcement, where they're looking more for you following the spirit of the law as opposed to the letter of the law. This enforcement style tends to be more accommodating and flexible. And really, there's likely a mix of the two, where in some cases you'd want to be more punitive, but in others you want to be a little bit more flexible or cooperative. So what we covered for today, we defined rules and regulations. We explained why Congress delegates these powers of rulemaking over to agencies. We discussed the process of rulemaking, both nationally and at the state level. And finally, we covered the implementation of rules. For your discussion sections, we're going to be examining how views of regulations have changed over time. We're also going to explore the Federal Register, and we'll describe the process of rulemaking and where you might want to influence it as a business. And then finally, we're going to wrap up with a discussion of discretion in enforcement. But I will see you over in your discussion sections.